Honey, Stephen A. Smith and Nancy Grace, they are not happy when it comes to Nolan Wells' results. They both feel like something ain't right. And guess what? Dr. Umar is in here too. Dr. Umar has something to say. And baby, when I tell you, Mississippi, Ocean Island or Horn Island, Ocean Springs, oh baby, y'all gonna have to answer. Y'all gonna have to answer. We're not letting up. Y'all want us to let up. We are not letting up. We know those boys ain't nothing but liars. And honey, let's roll. I got this video I want you guys to see and let me know what your thoughts about this. Check it out.
At this particular moment in time,
I think that it is very murky. And I do not understand, Stephen, the demands on all platforms for the investigation to be shut down. Is it possible Nolan Wells died by accident? Yes, it's possible. Is it possible that there was foul play? Yes, that is possible. And I don't believe the investigation should be shut down until we know the answer to that. I have 2 children, both the age of Nolan Wells. I would be lying on the courthouse steps screaming for justice if the investigation into a death related to them.
Nolan Wells went to Horn Island with friends on July 4th. His friends eventually returned. Nolan did not. 2 days later, his body was recovered. The public was quickly given a possible explanation: drowning. But drowning doesn't automatically answer every question about what happened before Nolan entered the water. And now one name keeps appearing whenever the timeline is reconstructed: Warren Hudson. Not because this transcript proves Warren caused Nolan's death, it doesn't. But because his account has to be measured against the timeline, the phone evidence, the emergency call, other witnesses, and the forensic questions surrounding Nolan's death. And that is where this story becomes difficult to ignore. On July 4th, an 18-year-old college football player went to Horn Island with a group of friends. By the end of the day, the group returned without him. Nolan Wells was missing. Then, his body was found. Since then, one explanation has dominated the discussion: accidental drowning. But the final afternoon contains a series of questions that refuse to disappear. Where was Nolan during the critical 3:30 to 4:30 window? What happened around the 4 p.m. emergency call? Why did Nolan's phone become part of the investigation? And does Warren Hudson's account explain every important minute before Nolan disappeared? Nancy Grace and Stephen A. Smith raised questions about the case. Dr. Umar pushed those questions even further, and a medical expert explained why the autopsy may not settle everything. Nolan Wells was 18 years old and from Ocean Springs, Mississippi. On July 4th, he traveled to Horn Island with friends. The group reportedly consisted of multiple boats and a much larger group of people. At some point, however, Nolan became separated from the group. The people who returned did not bring him back. That single fact created the mystery, because now investigators had to reconstruct an entire afternoon from memories, phone records, witness statements, and physical evidence. And one of the people whose account became important was Warren Hudson. The question isn't simply whether Warren gave an explanation. The question is whether that explanation fits everything else. Dr. Umar directly addressed Warren's account and raised questions about the decision to leave Nolan behind. His comments are important because even Umar stopped short of claiming that Warren had been proven guilty. Instead, he framed his concerns as questions.
I'm not saying he's innocent. I'm not saying he's guilty, but I got a few questions for you, Warren. Since you could sit down and interview with Officer BT, I need you to sit down and interview with Dr. Umar Ifatunde. So you can sit down and interview with Officer BT. I want you to sit down and interview with Dr. Umar Ifatunde. My first question to Warren: you said that Nolan is a best friend of yours, that he's like a brother. I have a question. If Nolan is your brother and best friend, why did you leave him on that island, especially when you all were drinking?
That distinction matters. A question is not a conviction. But in an unresolved death investigation, questions about the final movements of the victim can become extremely important. According to the discussion surrounding the case, Nolan was reportedly expected to return with his friends. Yet he didn't. So investigators have to establish exactly when that plan changed. And that takes us to the most important part of the timeline. Several accounts placed Nolan's final known movements during the afternoon. One account involved Javon, another involved a coach. Katie reportedly described a conversation with Nolan that stretched from approximately 3 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. Those accounts do not automatically prove anyone lied, but they create a window that investigators can test. And according to Dr. Umar, that window is critical.
So again, Javon sees Nolan at 3:40. The coach sees Nolan between 2:30 and 3:30. Katie sees Nolan between 3 and 4:30. I already told you I believe Nolan was unalive between 3:30 and 4:30.
Now, the timeline becomes extremely important because if the final sightings cluster around the period before 4 p.m., investigators have to explain what happened immediately afterwards. And something significant happened at almost exactly that point. The boat reported an emergency. Around 4 p.m., a call was made to STO concerning the boat. The reported problem involved the vessel taking on water. That call creates an independent timestamp in the middle of Nolan's disappearance. But it doesn't answer the most important question. Where was Nolan? If Nolan was still on the island, what happened next? If he was supposed to return with the group, why wasn't he on a boat? And if the boat was experiencing an emergency, how does that event fit into Nolan's final known movement? These are not accusations, they're timeline questions. And Nancy Grace has repeatedly emphasized that the investigation should not be shut down before those questions are answered. Nancy's position is important because she does not present one explanation as proven. She acknowledges that Nolan could have died accidentally, but she also says foul play remains a possibility until the evidence rules it out. That makes the Warren question more specific. Instead of asking, is Warren guilty? The more useful question becomes, does Warren's account explain what happened to Nolan?
Consistent with anything along that verbiage with what people are saying about these kids that were with him?
No, I don't know the answer to that. They say Nolan chose to stay behind because he met a girl he wanted to talk to named Katie. That girl has spoken through her sister, we are told. And she says Nolan told her, I'm going back with my friends. So who am I supposed to believe? I don't know for a fact that what the boys are saying is true. I don't know for a fact that what the boys are saying is false. I do know they called Ceto, S-E-A, second word T-O-W, and said that their vessel was sinking. But yet they continued boating around in it for hours after.
Nancy's point is essentially that investigators cannot simply choose which account they prefer. Every version has to be tested, and if different witnesses provide different timelines, investigators have to reconcile them. Because Nolan only disappears once, there can only be one sequence of events. Then another piece of the story becomes impossible to ignore, Nolan's phone. A missing person's phone can become a timeline of its own. Location information, Life 360. Snapchat, messages, device activity, even deleted information can potentially leave digital traces. But digital evidence has to be interpreted carefully. A location mismatch does not automatically mean someone lied. A missing Snapchat post does not automatically mean someone deleted evidence. But if digital records contradict the physical timeline, investigators need to explain why. And Nancy Grace specifically raised that issue.
He let them leave, even though his cell phone was on the boat.
His phone.
Okay. His phone, rather. His phone was on the boat or whatever, which brings me to this question, because there were some questions about these conflicting stories coming out in the case of him staying behind to talk to a girl, a cell phone date, and inconsistencies between Life 360 and Snapchat locations. Talk about that for a quick second before I let you get on out of here, Nancy.
I certainly will. I've consulted with digital forensics experts, and they say that there can be a difference between Snapchat location and Life 360 location and your iPhone, Find My iPhone location.
Yes.
So we have to make these things jive, and we may learn something nefarious or not. Now, we're also being told that there was no cell coverage there. I don't believe that, because the young man out on the boat called Ceto and I could hear him just fine. So there was cell. So the mom was concerned. She didn't see any Snapchat or anything going on during this certain period of time. So we have to, and you can look, Stephen, even if you delete and you delete it from deleted and it's not stored in the cloud, can still find out if something was deleted because it leaves a trail.
Now consider what that means for Warren's account. If Nolan's phone was somewhere different from where witnesses said Nolan was, that matters. If Life 360 and Snapchat show different information, that needs to be reconciled. And if the phone's final location can establish who had possession of it, that could become one of the most important pieces of the timeline. But the phone creates another question. Why was Nolan's phone not with Nolan? Dr. Umar has focused heavily on Nolan's phone and keys. He argues that investigators should ask why Nolan was left behind without them. That is his interpretation of the circumstances, not an established finding of guilt. But it is precisely the kind of question that can be tested.
He knows she didn't hear from her son, Art, because he has her son's phone. How can the mother hear from Nolan when you have Nolan's cell phone and you left him on an island? And I bet you didn't tell her you had his phone. Because if she knew you had his phone, Art, she would not have had to use Life 360 to find the phone. If you had his phone and you called her at 11 o'clock to see if Nolan was okay, why didn't you tell Nolan's mom you had his phone? Why did my sister Christine and my sister Tashima have to use Life 360 to find their son's phone? Because you playing games. You playing games. You playing in our face like we stupid. That's what this is.
There is a major distinction here. If Warren's explanation can be independently corroborated, then the phone issue could have an innocent explanation. But if the phone's location, witness statements, and Warren's account cannot be reconciled, investigators have a legitimate reason to look closer. That is the line between suspicion and evidence, and the next question makes the story even broader. Dr. Umar points to the fact that the group was not operating on a single vessel. His account describes approximately 30 young people spread across 3 boats. That raises an obvious investigative question. If all 3 boats traveled to Horn Island together, why should only one boat receive the greatest scrutiny?
This may be, they left the morning of July 4th. They arrived on White Devil's Horn Island at about 11:30. So 3 boats, 30 youth, they went together. I'm not clear on whether the 3 boats came back together or not. That's another question that I have, Art. Did they come back together the same way they left together? Because I'm treating all 30 of those white youth and all 3 of those ships as crime scenes and as suspects. All 3 ships are potential crime scenes. All 3 boats are potential crime scenes. And all 30 youth are potential suspects. I don't know why Jackson County Sheriff Ledbetter or Jackson County District Attorney Mulrath, I don't know why they decided to separate the boat that Nolan was on. Warren's boat, I don't know why they separated that boat from the other 2 for purposes of investigation and analysis. Because those 3 boats operated as a team. And since they went out there as a team, and it hasn't been made clear to me whether or not they came back together as a team, all 30 white youth and all 3 boats should have been part of this investigation, not just the one boat. That is my first big issue with this case. Who decided to separate the other 2 boats and the other 20 or so youth? I got a problem with that, Art, because according to the Cajun Navy, they have no GPS information.
This is where the conspiracy theory becomes broader. The theory is not simply about Warren. It asks whether the entire group and all 3 boats were investigated with the same level of scrutiny. Were the other boats tracked? Were their GPS records examined? Were the witnesses interviewed separately? Could another boat help explain Nolan's final movements? None of those questions proves that another person was involved. But if investigators are trying to reconstruct a disappearance, every relevant vessel potentially matters. Until this point, the story has focused mainly on people, timelines, and digital information. But eventually, investigators have to answer the most basic question. What does the medical evidence actually establish? That's where Dr. Kesha Davis enters the story. She explains why a body recovered from water does not always produce a simple forensic answer.
A body in water, are those due to, drowning? And can we say that, or is it undetermined? There was a Finnish study, and that study unfortunately said that about 16% of those bodies found in water were undetermined, where we couldn't say they drowned in the water or they were unalive before they were put in the water, right? That's the problem. And the same thing in this case. We don't have the stories to say the person truly drowned. We weren't there. We can't speak to Nolan Wells, and the other individuals are not necessarily speaking. So that's where the problem goes to the autopsy. And we want the autopsy to say, is there water in the lungs? Is this definitely a drowning? Well, the body was recovered not directly after, right? It's a couple of days. And so therefore you're dealing with decomp. And then the first autopsy is sealed. So what do? You have the second autopsy who got the lungs that are cut up. So the water in the lungs, you can't necessarily see that when the lungs have been dissected through, which is the normal procedure anyway. So being undetermined, yeah, it can happen. It definitely can happen in it. And that's where I think people don't understand we're a chapter in the story.
That explanation changes the way the public should interpret the word drowning. Drowning can describe a mechanism of death, but it does not automatically explain every circumstance surrounding the death. The story still matters. The witness account still matters, the timeline still matters, and the condition of the body still matters. That's why the independent autopsy became so important. The independent examination was not simply a second opportunity to look at an untouched body. The first examination had already taken place, organs had already been examined. Some tissue was no longer available to the second examiner in the same condition. That can make a later forensic interpretation more difficult.
That's a great question. And Dr. Judy Melanek had said this in a post that the second autopsy literally is hindered. It's like blindfolding yourself, and now you got to figure out to go through a maze. You probably saw it in a flash. You got 10 seconds to see it. Now you got to figure it out. That's what the second autopsy is, literally. The first autopsy, they have every right, because this is their jurisdiction, to do the best that they can, right? Dissect the organs. So when we do dissection, I want to step back just a second. We do a dissection, right? We have to take all the organs out and look at them in block. So for instance, if there was something in the larynx or in the throat, when they are cutting through to look through everything, that's going to be dislodged, right? If they're concerned about someone getting strangulated, that's taken out as a block, and that's why the second autopsy didn't have it. So he has to wait for the first autopsy. But things that you see on first initial examination, when you're cutting up the organs, because we slice them, what we call bread loafing. We slice the organs thinly to look for things. Maybe there was something lodged in there. Maybe there was there's changes like of drowning. Maybe there was actually break of the hyoid bone, which can be seen with strangulation. But the second forensic pathologist has to wait to get all that. So it's very hard.
That does not automatically mean the first examination was wrong, and it does not automatically mean the second examination proves foul play. It means some questions may remain difficult to answer without the complete forensic record. And then there's the discoloration described around the back of Nolan's head. This detail has generated enormous speculation. Some people see discoloration and immediately think impact, but pathology is not that simple. A red mark can have multiple possible causes. It can involve injury, it can involve postmortem changes, it can involve decomposition, and the surrounding tissue has to be examined before anyone can confidently determine what caused it.
So decomposition can do a lot of things based on the stage. We're talking about the stage, the time, right? The temperature, the water, the conditions that the body was in. Was the body moved? So this is what he said. And people are equating a bruise, an actual bruise contusion that happens while you're living, right, to what he said was red discoloration, right? So you have a sign, you have something you see, and now what could be the cause of that sign could be multiple things. We do it in medicine all the time. We have a finding. Now, what caused that finding? And multiple things can lead to the same thing. It's a redness in the back of the head. Yes, it was a nice size amount. He put the size on there. However, he said two things. If you look on top of the skin, there was no breakage of the skin, which would have been another clue to help us say, oh, yes, somebody must have hit him. There's a laceration. Then underneath that red discoloration, the bone was not broken. There was no fractures. He had even looked additionally in other parts of the body where the overlying skin didn't show anything of concern, just to make sure he didn't see any fractures. That doesn't mean anything did not happen to this individual. It means that the red discoloration, we cannot necessarily say it was a contusion due to someone hitting him or was post-mortem.
That is why the medical evidence should not be used as a shortcut to a predetermined conclusion. It doesn't prove Warren was involved. It doesn't prove Warren wasn't involved. It explains why the forensic evidence has to be interpreted alongside the rest of the case. And now all of the major pieces are on the table. Start with what is actually known. Nolan went to Horn Island with friends. The group eventually began returning. Nolan did not come back. There were multiple accounts of his final movements. A distress call was made around 4 p.m. The boat later continued moving. Nolan's phone became part of the investigation. Digital location questions were raised, multiple boats were involved, and the medical evidence has not produced a simple public answer to every question. None of that proves Warren Hudson caused Nolan's death, but it explains why his account remains important. Because Warren's version has to fit the same timeline as everyone else's. If the account can be independently verified, the mystery becomes smaller. If important parts cannot be reconciled, the questions become bigger. And that is the real meaning behind the title. Nancy Grace and Stephen A. Smith are not handing the public a conviction. They are asking whether the investigation has answered the right questions. Dr. Umar takes those questions further and raises a darker possibility. Dr. Kesha Davis explains why the forensic evidence cannot simply be reduced to one word. And Nolan's family is still left with the same question: what happened during those final hours? The 3:30 to 4:30 window, the 4 p.m. call, the phone, the boats, the witnesses, the autopsy, and Warren Hudson's account. Put them together, and the case still has unanswered pieces. Maybe every one of those pieces has an innocent explanation. Maybe Nolan's death was a tragic accident. But if that's ultimately what happened, the evidence should be able to reconstruct that story. Until then, the most important question isn't who does the internet believe? It's what can the evidence actually prove? If you think Nolan Wells' final timeline still needs answers, tell me which piece deserves the closest look. Warren's account, the 4 p.m. call, the phone data, the other boat